Microsoft, as always, anything with Azure, they just changed the name of the data management and the analytics scenario. Now it's called Cloud Scale Analytics. Doesn't really matter much, but if you're looking for a data management scenario, you will not find it. So because this is in an introductory setting, I'm not sure how many people I will bore to death, but I want to set the setting a bit with infrastructure as code. Then I'll talk a bit about Cloud Adoption Framework in general, looking into the cloud foundation. Then we're going into scenarios and why scenarios, and then dive a bit deeper into the Cloud Scale Analytics scenario, which is the only pure data solution that is, or scenario that is in here. And then, of course, what should we use it for? As you might already know, everything is code in the cloud. And when we're talking about infrastructure as code, in Microsoft Azure, you have the baseline, which is called ARM. It's Azure Resource Management. And then you have templates to use for different things. So whenever you go into your portal and you order a SQL DB or a managed instance or decide to spin up a Synapse cluster, you will be deploying an ARM template under the hood. And all the hoops you go through then actually fills out that template properly. Then you have Terraform, which is third-party open source solution made by HashiCorp, or it's made by HashiCorp, open sourced, and then they, of course, sell you support and so on to that. And then Microsoft, during the pandemic, released Bicep. And I'm not sure if I need to explain why they've chosen Bicep, but it is a pun on ARM, just in case you didn't notice that. And the Azure landing zones, so all to do with the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework, can be found in all different languages. You can find blueprints in ARM, in Terraform, and in Bicep. ARM is Azure Resource Management. And as I mentioned, it is the core of Azure services. So every time you can do something, even if you build in Terraform or in Bicep, you will be spinning up ARM templates under the hood. It is JSON-based, and of course, you can sit right in a JSON as much as you want. But the longer that template becomes, the harder it becomes to manage. So it can be a pain, and it's quite wordy as well. So it's it's not my favorite tool for doing these things. And yes, blueprints available in ARM templates. Surprise. Terraform, as I mentioned, that is HashiCorp Terraform. So it's HashiCorp also has a lot of other solutions. Among others, they have Consul and they have Vault. So other infrastructure or code-based open source solution that can help you in your clouds or even on-prem settings. And Terraform is open source. It is multi-cloud, so you can create Terraform code for an AWS, for GCP, or for Azure. And it is the most popular and most widespread used infrastructure as code template or language these days. It is a declarative language, also quite wordy, but the benefit of Terraform is that you can create modules instead of just writing one single huge blob of an ARM template. You can create modules where you say, okay, this module will be my data governance resource group, for instance, which you then can add in code for spinning up a Purview account, code for a storage account, code for Key Vault, and so on, and then bundle that into a module. And then you can create several modules and then build pipelines. So you deploy all your code or check off which modules you want to deploy. And yes, generates ARM templates when compiled. The problem with a third-party solution, of course, is that whenever Microsoft rolls out a new service, which happens, or change, which happens roughly 1,000, 400, 1,400 times a year, those changes or that new service might not be available in Terraform as the launch happens. It might take a week, might take a month, 5 months, depends. But it is still the most popular infrastructure as code language. Even Microsoft uses this themselves. And particularly, I know they use it for Databricks, or at least they used to do that. It might have changed these days, but as everything else changes so quickly. But yes, they used to use Terraform for Databricks because that worked the best. And just recently, Microsoft also launched a new module to support Terraform, which allows you to actually take an existing resource and import that the underlying ARM code that is in our portal or in your subscription, and create a Terraform module out of that. So that's a quite nice little tool. It was launched a couple of weeks ago, so it's very new. Then we get to Bicep, and again, hopefully you can see the Bicep pun. And it is new declarative language from Microsoft. As I said, it was launched roughly 2 years ago. It's still only in version 04 last time I checked. It might be version 045 or 05 now, but yeah, it's still not 1.0, which means that it is still a bit immature, even though from the traction I've seen among coders, particularly other MVPs, it does seem to get a nice traction and gain popularity among people who then switch out Terraform and, of course, ARM in favor of Bicep. With Bicep, you can create modules, but you can also build a hierarchy of modules into a library, which means that you can build and deploy a complete solution for instance, a Databricks platform or a Synapse platform, and have all the different modules in place and check and remove whatever you need, and then decide on this is what I want to roll out, deploy from GitHub. And because it is a Microsoft native language, it means it's also, allegedly at least, supporting all new features as they come out. But because it's a bit immature, I've seen that at least some modules or some services don't really get support in Bicep out of the box as they should. Purview, for instance, took a little while before it got out in a stable module, but going forward, this is definitely a language to watch. And if you take a library or a set of modules that you want to deploy because you want to build your complete infrastructure or your complete environment in Azure using Bicep, so you build your pipeline, you check off the different modules you want to deploy. And as you can see here, here is a high-level deployment flow. So you check off, yes, I want my management groups, I want my subscriptions, I want my control planes, and so on. And then you place that into the pipeline so it will roll out according to the orchestration pattern that you have, which means that you can have a new subscription or a new sandbox or a new full platform out and rolling in Azure within a very short time. And in case you have that scenario or that module written and ready for you. And of course, Microsoft has a huge bunch of different deployment blueprints ready for you to play around with, so you can pick them up and play around with. And that is, again, why this session is what this session is all about, to showcase what you can do to test these things and get you familiarized with them. And typically, this is where I would roll out a demo. There is not a lot I can show you because I haven't got the rights to deploy things, or at least some of the basic patterns are not available to roll out. But let's just look at Bicep. I've downloaded the Bicep landing zone repo from GitHub. I have a link to that in the chat, so you can, sorry, not in the chat, but in the slide deck, which will be shared later on. So you can just go into GitHub and grab it yourself. But it contains everything that you want to roll out. So all the modules bundled into a Bicep library where you have your role definitions, hub networking, logging, management groups, policies you want to put in place, and so forth. And if we go into, let's say this, and we have, this is the Bicep code. It is quite nice and easy. This module, Visual Studio Code has Bicep add-on that you can install. And the add-on gives you then a very nice place to develop your code. And it is, of course, also complete with IntelliSense and everything that you need to do. So it's a quite handy place to work with your Visual Studio, with your Bicep codes to deploy. And since you have this blueprint ready, it's for you to take control of add the features that you want or remove features that you don't want, and so on. And then you can deploy that at will. It is, of course, open sourced. Right, Cloud Adoption Framework. And Cloud Adoption Framework, or CAF for short, is a set of recommendations, tools, blueprints, and best practices that Microsoft gets ready to, sorry, if you hear barking in the background, it's one of my dogs who's not happy with being alone. Anyways, it is a set of blueprints and best practices for your use, or their users or customers to use when deploying into the cloud. And it's basically, starting out, it was meant as a tool for people who are migrating into Azure for the first time, but it is becoming such a nice and powerful tool that it is a great option to take control over your existing environment, or when you want to solidify or you want to do a data platform part, you can build upon the Cloud Adoption Framework as well. So it's not just for new customers or migrations. And because everybody loves three-letter acronyms, it builds on top of WAF, or the Well-Architected Framework. And if you're new to Azure, but you've been to AWS or GCP, you will probably recognize, or if it's not Well-Architected Framework, they call it something else, but all the different cloud vendors have their version of this. So it is a very nice way to support customers to make sure that they follow the best practices and have guidelines in place to work on. And the Well-Architected Framework and CAF goes or guides you through a migration journey, because again, going to the cloud is not just a one-off shot, it is a journey. So you define your strategy, you plan for your migration or for your initial deployment, and then you go through the ready phase, which is setting up everything, and then you do an adoption, whether you're doing migration or innovation. And then, of course, underpinning everything here is the governance and management of that. And the Cloud Adoption Framework itself, or at least the code and the architecture that we're going to be going through today, is all placed within the ready phase of CAF. So first of all, you want to select your operating model, because of course, not everybody is ready for an enterprise scale version. You might have central operations, you might have central operations, enterprise, or you might do distributed operation. And for each of these models, there is a recommended best practice for you within the CAF setting. However, what I've been dealing most with and what we'll be looking at today is enterprise scale. But before we go on, I want to make us all come on to a baseline of Azure hierarchies, because again, we're going to be throwing around a lot of different terms and words today. So tenant is the basic or the uppermost encompassing part of your Azure home. Then you have management groups, because you can have multiple subscriptions and multiple settings within a tenant. And to be able to govern subscriptions that are can be equally placed, or they can be bundled, they can be set within the same scenario or same department or same something, business domain, for instance, then you can use management groups to bundle these together and apply policies that only apply to a set of subscriptions. Or you can have policies that are tenant or enterprise-wide, and then you can trickle down to have more finely controlled policies on a set of management groups and fewer subscriptions. Which of course means that subscriptions is the next level in your Azure hierarchy. And in the end, you have resource groups, which then have resources tied into them. Mainly in an enterprise scale, Microsoft looks at subscriptions and resource groups, but there are also management group scenarios bundled into this. And as you can see here, you have several different subscriptions that can be nestled into one management group. And if you're going to an enterprise scale, you might have a business unit with different geographies, and then prod, non-prod environments for different geographies under there, and then the subscriptions in this case, it's mission critical, protected, shared. It might also be subscriptions on the business domain within that business unit, and then either an app within that resource group, or it can be a data product. It can be different things. So we'll look at them later on. And all of these levels are applicable if you want to apply policies or security groups or security accesses, networking, and so on. You can put them on all the different levels. At least, well, networking can't put it on a management group level, but on a subscription level, for instance. So these are all places where you can fine grain and put control into your systems. And of course, this is also important because you want to make sure that all the different subscriptions and resources underneath are following a common set of baseline best practices, including financial, so billing. I've been in with customers where the billing part wasn't really realized or enforced until a couple of years into the project, and we had consultants in that been spinning up resources that's just stood there and drawing money for a year without anybody really noticing, because the person who was footing the bill didn't look at it. He just checked it off until somebody suddenly screamed at him, and then all hell break loose. Okay, common terminology. When you're talking with, okay, I'm a data guy, and I guess most of the rest of you are data guys as well. When you're talking with infrastructure engineers or infrastructure architects or application architects, when we talk about platform, when I think of a data platform, that is a set of services that build where I deploy my data analytics services. I load my data in and I do whatever with it, and then I have Power BI to consume for consumers to use it. But a platform for an infrastructure guy or for somebody who's working on the foundational part of the cloud, that is everything that is running on your Azure tenant. So the platform is the baseline, the common ground for everything that runs in Azure. So I've been also experiencing that me and the infrastructure architect have been talking at each other without really understanding what the other one said. So platform in this setting is not a data platform. It is the platform as the common baseline of all Azure services. Then you have landing zones. And again, a lot of people talk about data landing zones. So that's what you are thinking about. But the landing zone is an environment for hosting your workloads pre-provisioned through code. And this can be many different things actually, but you have a landing zone as the first entry point into Azure. So when you come from on-prem, let's say you follow a TCP/IP packet out of your network into Azure, and the first place it comes in after it exited the VPN or Azure Express route will be your initial governance landing zone. And the landing zone itself is scalable. So it's meant to grow with your business. It is modular, so you can start off with a subset of services and then build on that as you go along. And it has a set of, again, from the CAF recommendations, there are a set of design considerations when you're building your Azure landing zone. So you need to think about billing. You need to think about your tenant, how to connect it to that, what kind of identity and access management you want, what kind of network topology and connectivity, resource organization, security management, governance, DevOps, automation, and so forth. So the landing zone in itself establishes an enterprise control plane, which allows you to set up your baseline policies, your baseline guardrails for controls, for security, for logging, all these things. But each and every landing zone can be different. So you can have a centrally managed landing zone where you have hub spoke architecture. So then landing zone, initial landing zone will be the hub of this topology. And then you have subscriptions as spokes that can be application relevant, or they can be domain relevant or whatever. And of course, you can have a very, very simple landing zone, which is just a single workload where you have your infrastructure, some security, data and application in place. But you still need to think about all these underlying control plane mechanisms. We had the breach in Norway last week where somebody managed to hack into an unsecured, wide open SQL DB that had been deployed to offload a database from a cloud, from a data center that was about to be migrated. And because it was a test DB, nobody really thought about it. And it even then contained production data for some reason. But if you had put, or if they had deployed their landing zone with the recommended best practices for security and policies in place, nobody would have been allowed to create that database that way. Probably had a very bad password. You can enforce password policies. It had ports open to the internet. You can shut down that as well with a policy and refuse to have any services to be deployed with the network or internet connectivity in place. It's rather important. And as I mentioned, the finance perspective, the cost management perspective as well is really important to put in place here. So you manage to get tags in place so you can have a tagged policy of how the naming convention for that is and so on. So even though you're not an enterprise, you might be a smaller business, having all these going through the enterprise control plane is still recommended, at least from my point of view, because it forces you to think about things that, well, if you don't think about it, the hackers will. And this is an enterprise scale landing zone where you have your landing zone subscription at the bottom. And then you have some connectivity subscriptions, managed subscriptions, you have sandboxes. Of course, identity and access and identities and security features are all in your enterprise management setting, split into several different subscriptions, segregating as much as possible. And if you look at the demos, I tried to deploy the Cloud Adoption Framework landing zone accelerator, but as you can see here, you don't have authorization. Even though this is my tenant, it's still a demo tenant, which means that you need to have a commercial tenant for this to be able to do this. But the landing zone accelerators and everything that you need to do with your Azure tenant is, of course, you need to have tenant-wide admin rights to be able to deploy this. And then, of course, even then on demo subscriptions, this is locked down as well. The GitHub repo will also guide you through what kind of prereqs that you need to fill in, because, for instance, in this case, you need to go in and make sure that you have all the resource providers that you need to have them registered before you are allowed to go onwards with this. But again, I can't show you this because it's I don't have the rights for this, unfortunately. So hubs, I mentioned that before. Hub is the central terminology in your hub spoke networking topology, and the hubs are you can either use just a central hub with all the subscriptions that are relevant as spokes on that hub. You might have a hub, then connect that to a second hub, for instance, from a data management perspective. That might be so hub connected to a hub directly, or you can have several hubs that control the different environments that you have. So dev, Q&A, test, production, whatever. And again, hubs are the central networking places where you can also have the common key vaults, common EIM, security, logging, and so on. And the spokes in a hub spoke architecture is the application or function specific area. It is recommended from Microsoft to use subscription for everything. I know a lot of people are curious about that, because why can't we just use resource groups? Well, you can, but the options and the possibilities of segregating and putting better control mechanisms in place is stronger on the subscription level than it is on the resource group level. And it doesn't cost you anything to have a subscription. The costs go on the compute and storage and resource usage. So in that way, it doesn't really matter. It's also easier again to fine-grain control of your costs in subscriptions. And even though there was limits on how the number of subscriptions you can have in a tenant, I think that's around about 800 now, something. So it's really not a lot of restrictions on it. So go with resource groups or the subscription resource group recommendations from Microsoft on the enterprise scale on this is my recommendation. And in a hub-spoke setting, you would look something like this. So you have your on-prem environment connected via VPN or ExpressRoute into your Azure landing zone, which is the central hub. And then you have your management subscription, security subscription, monitoring, DevOps, sandboxes, data management, and so forth. The challenge with this is, of course, also that all the routing, network routing will go through that landing zone in the common setup, which might be okay. It depends. The challenge might arise if you're pushing a lot of data between, say, a data landing zone A or data landing zone B. If that has to be routed through the central networking hub, that can create a lag, which might not be wanted. And in that case, you can do VNet peering between the different spokes and connect directly between them instead for certain kind of scenarios. Of course, do use private endpoints and all security mechanisms you can put in place, because even if it's your tenant and your subscriptions, everything is still in the same data center as everybody else anyway. So it's important to do as much security mechanisms in place so that you can put in there. So the Cloud Adoption Framework comes with this guidance, all these the best practices, a lot of blueprints. It also has a nice little naming tool, which you can use to create your naming conventions, because naming conventions in Azure, in case you haven't tried that, it can be quite a pain, because there are some services support dashes, some support underscore, some support capital letters, some support numbers, but very few do everything, and some do none. So it's, for instance, storage, you can only have lowercase letters and nothing else. So it's important to have, or it's very nifty to have a naming tool that helps you and guides you through that setting. So that's the Cloud Adoption Framework at a glance. Let's look at the scenarios. And the scenarios at enterprise scale level is there to help you accelerate your deployment, your journey into Azure. And because it is written and designed by Microsoft, it means that it is optimized for specific workloads. It has all the best practices in place, and it has links to all the different features that are in place. But of course, it is also designed for enterprise scale, which means that everything is extra large, or at least not the smallest level you can think of. So use these enterprise scale deployments and blueprints. By all means, they are fantastic assets, but also have in mind that if you deploy it as it is right now, it's not cheap either. So go through them, adapt them to your needs, and then deploy them afterwards. So one of the scenarios you can have is a VMware solution. So all the best practices to lift and shift your on-prem VMware data center into the cloud. Then you have a hybrid and multi-cloud scenario, again, trying to help you get the most out of these settings. You have your modern application platform. You have SAP on Azure, which is again then how to deploy your SAP environments on VMs with the best configurations for different SAP boxes onto Azure. There is a retail industry, but only retail industry specific scenario. And then you have the cloud scale analytics, which is the former data management analytics scenario. And as I mentioned before, these are enterprise scale, which means that everything is scaled up or added a lot of things that might not be beneficial for a smaller company, but what Microsoft deems to be useful for enterprises. So why should you use the scenarios? And again, we're talking about cloud scale analytics as the scenario that we are looking at today. And the modern data platform consists of a lot of moving parts. I've presented on data platforms previously, and people have said, whoa, that's a lot of moving parts. How do you govern this? And of course, one of the main control mechanisms you have in such a place is using a modular approach and using infrastructure as code, so that everything is in your repo, which means that everything can be reproducible and redeployed, which also means that you can have a dev environment and you can have a production environment, but you only spin up a test or Q&A environment when you need them. In a CI/CD fashion, you might not ever need one, but if you do, probably once a month or maybe every quarter. And why should you pay for having that out in the first place? Well, if you just have everything as code, and as part of your build pipeline, you copy data after the services have been set up, you copy data from your test environment or from your prod environment into the Q&A environment, and then everything is just ready for you to test. So it is a very nice way to control. And that, again, is why I think that the cloud scale analytics scenario is very useful, both for existing data platforms, but also for building new ones. And in these settings, and this is the Gartner reference, it is end-to-end data analytics reference architecture. As you can see, there are a lot of different boxes here. Some of these are, of course, data plane or control plane. Some of these are for the use cases, but mostly there are lots of different services here. And if you're looking at Capgemini's approach to this, there are also lots of boxes, even more boxes. These boxes shouldn't be taken as this is what you need for the modern data platform, but it is different services or things that you might need, depending on your usage. So it's a way to guide you to look at different things. So you have, in the baseline, you have your cloud foundation, and the cloud foundation is this baseline cloud adoption framework part, where you have your infrastructure rolled out, you have your network connectivity sets up, cybersecurity in place, logging, GitHub, and so on. And then you have your data trust, or the green part at the top, where you have everything to do with governance. So it might be data discovery or lineage, data catalogs, data privacy, data lifecycle management, data loss prevention, and so on. And in the middle layer, you have the blues and the red boxes, which comes to the pure data platform specific services, such as, you want to have somewhere to ingest the data, you need to store that data somewhere, you need to, or you might want to model data or enrich it. So that's the light blue box. Then you have everything to do with semantic models, enterprise data warehousing, aggregated facts, or if you want to have AI into the mix. Well, if you do machine learning, you know you need a workbench to develop the models. You need to have a model catalog to make sure that you keep a track of the versioning of the models that are running. You have to have AI monitoring in place. You might have some other data engines and so on in place. And then the red box is for the consumption part. So that's where your user sits. So custom AI solutions, APIs, visualizations, Power BI, self-service, Excel, of course. Who wants to throw out Excel from a data platform? So so this is just, and now I remember the word capabilities. So it's a way to guide you to the different capabilities you might need in a modern data platform. Some might need everything, some might need just a few of them. But what you don't want to do is just go for the middle data layer and forget about the platform foundations or the data trust layer, because they are important for your success. And if you're looking at from an architectural paradigms perspective, you have your data lakehouse patterns, you might have data mesh, which is all the rage these days. And again, this is also something where a scenario such as cloud scale analytics will help you, because the ability to plan and control the complexity when you're using infrastructure as code is in your hands. So in your cloud scale analytics scenario, you will have one data management landing zone. That's where you have your central governance, and most likely that's your entry point in the network from the central hub into your data platform. And then you can have one or several data landing zones, one or several data products in each data landing zone. And then you have everything built upon the WAF, or the well-architected framework. And this will look, if we deploy this, So this, I've been to GitHub, chosen to deploy the full cloud scale analytics scenario. You might in GitHub just choose to deploy just a data management zone, or just a data landing zone, or just some data products. There are blueprints for just those parts as well. But I've chosen to deploy the full shebang, so you can look at it. You can edit the template, edit the parameters, visualize if you want, choose where you want to deploy it, tests, production, whatever. Then you go and fill in the data management zone. So yeah, this is going to be in my demo. I'm going to use North Europe, and I need to put in a prefix for my data management zone. So let's see, just close DM. And it was available, perfect. I can go on to the next one. For the data landing zone, I can actually choose to have that in another subscription. And I want to still have that in North Europe. And my data landing zone prefix will be, if I'm allowed to, it's a bit silly. Yeah, I don't know why it's just, but it's restricted to 6 letters or 7 letters. So it's quite picky that way. Then you want to generate the password, and it's just, and that doesn't work. Yeah, just copy. And you want to use Bastion. It costs a bit more, but it's that much more safe. And if you're using Macs, it's even easier to connect with using Bastion than when you're using a remote desktop. Then we want to have some different tags on this, and this is cloud scale. It is for purpose, it's demo, of course, and environment should be dev. Yep. And as I say, with everything else in this, it will take some time to review, and then I can create it. I have done that already, so let's see if I can. There we go. No, that was the wrong one. That was my last attempt. It's failed on my SQL server. And it don't. Okay, yeah, it didn't deploy this time either. Reasons why. Okay, yeah, I tried to create something that was already existing in West Europe, so it's failed on me. But and when I tried to deploy in West Europe last time, it failed because I wasn't allowed to deploy my SQL server on West Europe. Right, I need to do some cleaning up on my demo subscriptions, but there you go. It will take roughly 2 hours, 1.5 to 2 hours to deploy everything, but you get the full shebangles. Let's see if I just get it back again. There we go. So it spins up all your different servers, key vaults. As you can see here, it uses the prefix I give it, and there will be a lot of different key vaults as well to run into. Even though the generic names on these are not great. I wish they could have done something with that. But again, you can develop your own or go into the templates and edit the namings that they are giving here. So it's quite simple that way. Right. So Cloud Scale is targeting data mesh-like patterns in that it is, but of course, since it's free to adapt code, you can do whatever you want to with it afterwards. But it gives you a nice start of what you're doing. There are 5 modules in this, and one is the data management zone. And again, the data management zone will give you through the purviews, key vaults, storage accounts. If you don't have an Azure AD on your tenant already, it will deploy that and so forth. Then it will deploy a data landing zone or more, depending on your needs. Then you have a data integration batch and a data integration stream. And you have a data product module, which is previously everything was called both then 3, 4, and 5 were called data products, but they have changed names. So the data management zone is a once per scenario. It creates one subscription out of your tenant or off your Azure Hub connected to it. And it has all the management services that Microsoft thinks you need, which is something like this. You have AKS, so Kubernetes services with container registry. It has your Power BI connections, Synapse Private Link Hub. It has virtual networks, firewalls, security groups. And as you can see here, because it's one single subscription, everything is then separated into resource groups. It comes with logging installed, monitor, security center connections, and so forth. And of course, you can have some master data services if you want, data catalogs, which is of course Purview, and so forth. The data landing zone is a one-to-many, so you can have as many data landing zones as you like, 1 or 10. And this is where your data is persisted and your workloads are executed. So everything to do with ETL, with storage, the light blue box of the Capgemini framework, that's where that's the data landing zone. So yeah, the storage services, ingestion, management, again, because all the subscriptions that are deployed will have network components, monitoring components, log analytics, and so on. You can, of course, again, modify this because this is enterprise scale. You don't need that much detail here in your setting, but you can, that's what they give you, and you can just modify that later on. And the data landing zone, as I mentioned, it comes with network connectivity through your data management zone and then to the hub. It has data lake services, it has metadata services. That's why it failed on the MySQL server, because it tries to spin up a separate Hive metastore in MySQL. And you have key vault connections, then you have the ingest services, whether that be streaming or batch load, through Databricks or through Event Hubs, IoT Hub if you want, and of course Data Factory. Hopefully soon you can also specify a Delta Live table orchestration instead of the Data Factory if you want to do that. And then you can have, from this data mesh thinking, a data landing zone can be a data domain or a source domain, consumer domain, and you can then deploy your products into that zone, which means you can have a shared set of development environments within your domain, within your data landing zone, and then you can have products or specific use cases as resource groups within that, and that's for the next part. So data integration is mostly the same whether you're using batch or stream. As I mentioned, it is one-to-many, and they are deployed as resource groups within your data landing zone. So you can check off that you need one or both or many when you're deploying your data landing zone, or you can deploy a partially empty data landing zone and then deploy the data products later on if you want. And if you're using Bicep, of course, the data landing zone can be your library, and then you can have your modules underneath to pick and choose whatever you want to then deploy later on. So Data Factory and or Event Hub / IoT Hub. And of course, you can also adapt this to use Databricks streaming instead. There's a transformation services in place, both Data Factory, Synapse, Databricks, and Stream Analytics, again, depending on if you're using Stream or not. And there are also shared runtime services, so integration service, Data Factory integration runtimes, and so on. And the metastores. And at a closer look, this is roughly what will be deployed as just the data landing zone. Analytics and data science module is, as with the others, one-to-many, and they are deployed as resource groups within your data landing zone. They will come with a shared Synapse workspace, shared Databricks workspace, key vaults, data science services. That typically means Azure ML and cognitive services, but again, you might add or remove whatever you want. And of course, there are storage accounts connected to this as well. And this is, again, back to supporting a data mesh-like approach where individual independent data teams or cross-functional data squads can operate within that resource group to place their AD group to connection or access to that on the resource group level, and they can go in and do whatever they want and build their data products and deploy them into the mesh if they want, or they can just build their data marts for consumption later on. And again, this is the Manatee one. So you have X number of resource groups with this set of services for the shared work groups and the data applications. And yes, the demo which failed, so we'll just skip that. So why would you use Cloud Adoption Framework in general and specifically this scenario? And the main argument is that you have a baseline infrastructure, the blueprints in place, which you can adopt and change as you want. It rolls out with a set with the guidances on best practices, networking, cost management, and so on, which allows you to get started. You save a lot of development time while you're building your platform or your set of services, or if you want to just make sure that next time you deploy something, you have it in place. You can pull out ARM templates, change them into Bicep, for instance, or you can build everything again from scratch. But if you deploy this from scratch, you will use quite a lot of weeks to deploy it or develop it. But if you use CUF blueprints, you save that time, and you can then just adopt to what you need and reduce the sizes to what you need and so on. And if you're a consultant, that means that you can go out and sell to customers saying that, okay, competitor A will say he will build that data platform for you within a month. I can do it in a week, which is quite handy. You can say 2 weeks and just do it in 3 hours, and nobody will know the difference. You'll just have baseline earnings. So it also allows you to use the same language and the same terminology as the infra engineers when you're working with them, or with people who are non-data specific, which means it promotes a better cooperation. These days, of course, it's quite hard to get, well, it's quite hard to get any competent people, but a data squad or a data architect might not get hold of an infra engineer, or a company don't have infra engineers. So being able to learn at least the baselines of infrastructure as code and how to adopt these scenarios will actually also support your career and your company. And because it is infrastructure as code, you control your services with CI/CD, which also means you control your environments. As I mentioned previously, it allows you to have a full test and QA environment, if you want, ready to be deployed in a build pipeline in GitHub. And you can have it up and running in a couple of hours instead of having, a day or two, instead of having to wait or pay for having these things lying around waiting. Even though if everything is shut down, it will still cost you money in terms of storage. And cost management is such an important feature. So making sure that you have everything there under control, at least at a certain baseline, down to a product or a team level, is all the better for you. And this supports various data architectures, including data mesh, but it can also be used in a data lakehouse architecture or in a more generic data platform architecture if you want. So it is quite flexible in that manner as well. But either way, the data as a product thinking is something I recommend everyone to look into, even if you don't plan on implementing a data mesh anytime soon, because there's always a bit of a challenge to persuade CEOs or CXO people, the people with the money, that data is, or why they should spend more money on the data platform. Well, if you go away from looking at it as an asset or a cost center and say this is something that you can actually earn money on, that is often a good way to get their attention. And because it's open source, make that code your own, make the blueprints your own, fit them to your needs, save them, and then you can reuse as many times as you want. This is a picture that is what Microsoft calls the harmonized mesh. And it is their take on data mesh implementation using data visualizations of synapse, polybase connections, and synapse linked with connections and so on. And then have the central data management hub, central data hub, and the different independent data product teams around that. Quite a lot of boxes, might not be suitable for all, but this is, again, their first take on data mesh in an Azure environment. But data mesh is not really about technical solution, it's more about who does what and how, so people and processes. Right, so I will prattle along for an hour. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we've got a few questions. Let me jump straight in. Okay, so possibly the biggest barrier to cloud adoption is an organization's employee skill sets. Does the CAF help us understand what skills we need and how we can upskill?
Yeah, all documentation of Microsoft tend to have a skill recommendation. So when you go into the Microsoft Docs on Cloud Adoption Framework, you will see underneath a link and guidance on what you need to skill up on. You can also always start with Microsoft or Cloud Foundation certification and the training there, and then build upon that. But yes, there is a guidance on what you need to learn or what Microsoft thinks you need to learn on the documentation.
So is there a validation tool belt? I guess that is a code thing. So you can automate finding violations against the framework or any best practices.
There is not a tool belt as such, no. If you're using the blueprints and the policies that follow, that means that every time a new resource is deployed, there will be a validation check on those policies. So that in that case, you can say, yes, there is one, but out of the box, I haven't seen any specific tool belt for this now.
Right, so we've got a question from Melissa, one of our fantastic speakers. How commonly do you see organizations with greater than one tenant, i.e. greater than one Azure AD directory to deal with? My thought is it's fairly rare, only massive organizations.
I've seen it when I'm working with the global corporations, but that's not very often I do. Even though I work for Capgemini, I'm basically working a lot in the Nordic market, and there are not that many of that big customers. So normally you see one tenant, and then you'll see many subscriptions underneath, but just one tenant.
Cool. Aaron Slotnick, he asks, how did you get the template from the Azure portal? That is a really practical query.
Yeah, it's quite easy. What I did was I went to GitHub, and then you have a link, actually. So you can just right click and open. And just another tip for people, because you might use a lot of different tenants as a consultant. And even though in Edge and Chrome you can use profiles, it still opens another browser window, so you have several of them. In Firefox, you have something called a multi-account container. And I have, so I can just say that this link will open in any of the different account containers I have specified. So I have for different customers as well as for my MVP subscription and so forth. So it's, yeah, just a totally off the track tip for you, but it is in GitHub. You can just click on that and it will open and log in for you. And there you go. So it's quite easy. There's also links from the documentation sites where you can actually go and deploy directly if you want.
Great stuff. I'm presuming, Johan, that we don't have to learn Norwegian to do what you just did.
You have to, yes. Or Arabic, we can do that as well. No, it's...
Fair enough. Let's go on to the next question then. You're going to be able to guess who's asking this question. So the Cloud Adoption Framework seems like an awful lot of reading to get started, and I am lazy. What is the easiest way for me to get started using it and look like a rock star to my boss? I don't know if you could guess that it was me that asked that question.
No, that I completely missed the target. Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, it's there's an awful lot of documentation to go through, but I mean, of course, now that you've watched this session, you will have can just start clicking. But going to GitHub and diving into the code, of course, there will still be a lot of reading, but if you've done any sort of development using ARM templates or Bicep or Terraform, it will be quite self-explanatory, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But if you're brand new to everything that has to do with Azure usage, so services, tenants, all that overlying stuff, it might be a bit harder to just start with it. And I would definitely say you need to read through that documentation because there's so much good things to learn there. But you can, of course, if you have a subscription, Visual Studio subscription with Azure credits on, by all means, you can just click on the blueprints and deploy them and see how that goes. And but just remember not to add your credit card to it, so it will charge too much.
Cool. So continuing being lazy, when I use the cloud scale analytics scenarios, does it give me advice to which services I should use and why? For instance, when I use Synapse, Spark Pools, or Databricks, does it tell me which I should do or why I should do that in certain cases?
No, it doesn't. It gives you, it deploys both, so you can choose yourself. But basically, if you're brand new into this, and so you're deploying something from scratch, so there's no enterprise or company principle saying that you need to use Synapse or we're only using Databricks, I would say go for Databricks if you're developing SQL and Spark, because it's a lot more mature than Synapse is right now. Come back in another year or so and I might change my mind, but right now I'd say Databricks.
Excellent. So I think we'll move on to the very last question. This is really surrounding the future of CAF. So the Cloud Adoption Framework appears to be very light in tooling, but very heavy on documentation. Are we likely to see more tooling or accelerators to actually make implementation easier? For example, pre-written Databricks notebooks to implement common processing tasks.
Yeah, you will. It's moving that way. There's the blueprints weren't there a year ago. So the scenarios are quite new, and you will see more of that going forward. So yes, and I suspect that this will be a circular competition between the different cloud or hyperscalers. So when one says, okay, well, we'll make it even easier for you, and then, oh, wait, and Amazon comes in and says, well, we've done everything here. So yeah, I'm suspecting that it will get easier and easier. The problem, of course, is that as a customer, you need to remember that they do this to lock you into their services, which means that the more automatic or the more fancy tooling you get, the less control you get over what you're spinning up.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess that was the last question, as you said, Mark. Thanks to everybody for joining, and a big thanks to you, Johan.
I will send up the slides so you can people can download them. There you also have my contact information and their links to the things I've talked about today.